Hello, welcome to Miniature Realms. My name's Stuart. Games Workshop very kindly sent me a box of the new Ellyrian Reavers ahead of time, so let's build and paint some.
Miniature Realms is proudly sponsored by Counter-Attack Bases. They stock a wide range of counters, gaming aids and movement trays for multiple game systems, and offer custom items to suit your club, your event, or even your podcast or YouTube channel. Check out the link in the video description. The High Elf Realms for Warhammer the Underworld are here, or at least to pre-order at this point, depending on when you're watching the video. The book has been dissected and all the thoughts around the new rules, the list, the special characters are being shared and debated on the internet. But this video is about looking at some of the miniatures that Games Workshop very kindly sent me ahead of time. And these are the new Elven Reavers, a reworked set, a completely new set from those on the original Island of Blood, and they're really cool. So let's have a look at how they build and paint up. Like many of you, I'm sure, I was really surprised that these were going to be brand new. Of all the things that we would have predicted for the release, sometimes a new set of plastics for a core item in an army isn't what you're expecting. We obviously saw it with the launch of the Bretonians, and we saw those lovely foot knights, but as other releases came along, that more and more felt like it was a special thing to do with the launch of the game. So I was very surprised to see these as a brand new sculpt, and lots of people are confused, including myself, about them, whether they were brand new. And I've obviously got the frames, you can see them in front of you here, and they are absolutely brand new sculpts. They clearly very heavily inspired by the designs in the Island of Blood set, but they are new sculpts and completely multi-part. Very well described in terms of instructions. It's pretty easy to follow. It is worth following the instructions. I tried to go off piste on the second 5 I made and made a few mistakes, more because I was just assuming that they were a little bit more flexible than they were, and I found that what I was left with, a head or an arm or here, didn't quite match. So it is worth sorting your bits out and checking. But saying that, you do have flexibility. You can change the position of the arms, you can change the position on the waist. The legs are glued in or sculpted in as part of the main horse, but the top half you can do quite a lot, and I think that's pretty good. That's really cool. Occasionally, if you want to adjust that, you're going to have to think about how one hand holds the rein. But other than that, you're fine. And even if you've done a little bit of minor conversion work before, I think you can build a lot of flexibility, and there's a lot of scope for doing something different with these. I mostly stuck to the standard builds. I personally didn't build a standard bearer because I've built mine as 2 sets of 5 with musicians, which I'm sure is one of the most common ways of building these. But this guy here is the champion as built per the instruction, and he's going to be the subject of the painting part of this video. But I think these are really great. As I said, a bit of a surprise. I would have expected to see something else, or just not these at all, but what a welcome surprise they are. They are very, very cool, and I think they're pretty good in the game as well. Not in everyone's build, but I think they will see some play, and with beautiful miniatures like this, that makes it even more likely. So I'm going to start off with the airbrush, and I'm going to start with Two Thin Coats Greystone Blue and Model Air White from Vallejo. Now, all of the Two Thin Coats paints I use in this video are very easy convertible to Citadel if you're a Citadel user, and if you go to the Transatlantic Games website, there's loads of conversion charts and things as well. I have mentioned them in previous videos, but I'm not going to be doing that this time, just to try and keep the length of the video down a little bit. But what I'm doing here is essentially building up with a really nice sort of bluish tinted grey over the whole miniature, very much like a Zenithorn. If you've watched my Seaguard tutorial recently and my Eagle Claw bolt throw tutorial, have seen this. So the grey goes down first, and then the white. So it's quite a careful Zenithor. The idea is I'm going to be using these colours not just as a base coat, but also as the main body of the white on this miniature. And I really like that nice clean white art look that you get to High Elves from a lot of Games Workshop artwork and studio armies. And I wanted to recreate that. White can be hard to paint, and maintain its smoothness. So I'm using the airbrush for this in order to do that. The plan is to try and any white that I really want to keep in the miniature, build it up with the airbrush and leave it at that and just enhance it rather than have to go and layer up too much afterwards. So I am taking my time, making sure that I'm focusing the white in certain areas, making it a little bit heavier where I want to leave it white, but then for the rest of the miniature I'm giving myself a really nice zenithal base to work from. To give some of the detail a boost, I'm just going to use some white for dry brushing as well, in a way that many people have become familiar recently, a slap chop named by Rob at the Honest War Game. Obviously it's a technique that's been around for a long time, but that whole video he did, which was great fun, actually opened it up and made more people aware of the technique. So I'm not going all over the miniature here, but I'm definitely going where there are sort of details like fur and feathers, anything that can catch the edge. But there's so little paint on my brush because I don't want to have any streaking whatsoever. I really just want to enhance it. So when I start base coating in glazes, it will really pick up the detail. But before we get to any of that, this is Wizard Grey and Carcharodon Grey from the Two Thin Coats range, and I'm using a sponging tool from Knott's Hobby. There's a link in the video description, and if you use it, you actually get 10% off. You can just use a bit of sponge in your hand. There's two types of sponge that I'm using here. The firm white sponge that they supply at the moment, that they've got some new stuff on the way soon, so look out for that. And then also sort of standard foam you find in miniature packaging. And I'm actually layering up with sponging with these two greys because I want this horse to be a grey. And I'm trying something different here. What I didn't want to do here is have to paint the whole miniature grey and then try and get that white really smooth like I said. So I wanted to use that airbrush, but I'm now darkening the miniature down again. I didn't want to just go in with a contrast grey because it can be a little bit messy, can get lots of tide marks and things like that. And I didn't just want to paint it in flat either. So I thought I would try this method. This is the first time I'm doing it, and it's one of those trust the process, because I think you'll see later on that it works really well. You'll notice I cut that bit of foam down a little bit as well, just to round it off, so it gave me a smaller edge just to dip into the miniature. But all I'm doing is dipping on the paint on the dry palette, sponging it off, and then testing it on the palette first, and then just sponging it directly onto the miniature. If I do get it a little bit on some of the areas around it, it's not too much of an issue. The main area to keep it off is any of the white clothing or the white cloth areas. And there will be little areas around the edges towards what will be reins and things like that I can't quite get in there. And I will go in with a hairy brush in a moment, and I'll show you there. And this is that stage really. So I'm using an old brush and I'm still stippling. So rather than stippling with sponge or sponging, I'm stippling with the edge of the brush here to make it a little bit rough, give it some texture, but I'm just darkening down. And what will happen next is we build it up with lighter colours, it all starts to blend back in rather than looking like we're making a mess, which it does a little bit at this stage. As we move on to that next colour, that lighter grey, again, making sure there's not too much paint on that brush. You don't want to completely cover everything. You're just building up layers of texture. You start to hit the musculature on the horse, and that starts to leave the darker grey in the shadows underneath and starts to make it look less stark against the rest of the white. And you can see it lifting the colour and blending it back in a little bit. And that's the beauty of the sponging, and you start to see that the process is working. I decided I wanted to lighten it even more, so I've got some Trooper White from Two Thin Coats. I'm using the same sponging method with the lighter sponge this time, the one you get free in packages of blisters. Maybe not so much in Games Workshop anymore, they don't put the foam in there, but from other manufacturers you get a bit of grey sponge that you get to protect your miniatures, and I'm using that just to provide some texture, some speckles almost. So again, on the dry palette, take most of the paint off, test it first so you can see what mark it's going to make, and then move on to the miniature and just dapple it on. And now we want to glaze it all back down. So I've got Basalicanium Grey and Apothecary White, both contrast paints. I've got them on my wet palette, and I'm making a 50-50 mix for them, and then adding a little bit of water to thin it down as well. Water's fine here. You don't need to use contrast medium or thinner always. I want to keep it quite thin. And I'm just going in to start with around the edges where I want to shadow it, just to test out the darkness, and then I start blending it out over the whole area. And what it does, it ties together all those elements of sponging that I've been building up, including that top layer of the little white sponging, which is a little bit more visual because of the smaller marks that it's leaving. And I'm just doing this slowly. I'd rather build it up slowly layer by layer and then go into dark straight on. But I'm focusing in those shadowed areas, blending it out into the center with a clean brush. So I'm using the same brush most of the time, going around the edges, quickly cleaning it off, then feathering and blending it out and just building it up bit by bit. Once that initial layer is complete, I'm going back in just with the Basilicanum grey, which is on my wet palette still. I'm focusing right around the edges of all of the detail, so around those other parts of the miniature. So I'm painting in now the recess shading, and again slowly blending it out, so cleaning that brush off quickly. There's very little paint on my brush. You can see I'm just dipping it in, adding it into the recesses of the muscles, that kind of thing. I'm just adding in the shadows rather than building up the highlights. And you start to get this nice effect where you've got a light grey, the blend from the white part of the large socks on the horse up towards or down towards the darker grey in those recess areas. And you're able to do this all with contrast paint. So far we've done no edge highlighting at all. We've used the airbrush to give ourselves that base. We've used sponging, which is a really easy technique to pick up. And now what we're doing is recess shading and glazing, which is also easier and requires a little bit less brush control than slowly building up layer by layer with the paints, which you may do a more conventional way of painting this kind of thing. This is the Apothecary White. I'm just using it straight now, straight over all of the hair on the horse. Some nice even coat, because I don't want it to pull too much, but it will just nicely turn all of that white on the horse's hair into a grey. Slightly thinner, but I'm using it on the feathers as well. And much of the feathers are going to be white, so it just shades those perfectly. This is Pilar Glacier, which is a very, very light contrast paint, almost just a ready mixed glaze in a pot. And if you've watched those previous high elf tutorials that I mentioned, then this is the white method I've been using. So again, I'm recess shading here, where you've got the white that's been built up with the two stages, so the grey and then the white with the airbrush. I'm going back into the darkest areas with this Pilar Glacier, allowing it to pull there and then feathering and blending out, but keeping it in those recesses. So you end up with a really nice bluey tinted white, which I think is just perfect for high elves. Now I'm taking inspiration from the studio paint job on this, but I'm adding a little bit less blue. So some of these parts of cloth that are blue on that studio paint scheme, I'm keeping to white. That matches the little army that I've got planned, the little project I've got planned, which you'll learn more about in future weeks and months. But the real trick to this is keeping in those recesses, not on those larger flat areas of white, because you can leave it then. I will come back and do a little touch of highlighting, but you can also leave it and you get this beautiful effect. This is our Sermon Blue and Talisar Blue. Now, I recommend using Talisar Blue for this, but the reason I'm showing both is because I've been inconsistent. I used the Talisar in my Seagull tutorial and the other in my recent Eagle Claw Bolt Thrower. And then this is Almath Blue and Hiri Blue from the Scale Cutter Fantasy Games range, which I use for highlight. Now, when you complete the full highlight on this, those two differences in contrast blues makes very little difference, and that's why I made the mistake. But I think the Talisar Blue is a little bit more vibrant at the pot and works very well on these smaller areas, and I'm not adding too much blue for this. If you are doing a larger area, and then maybe the other blue will work, by the time you've highlighted with that mid-tone and the highlight that I showed from the Fantasy Games ranges, you can't really tell the difference. So that is why, in case anyone's watched both tutorials and wonder there's a difference, I thought I'd mention it in this video now, which is going to be going out over a week since the last ones. But I'm going around all of the trim that I've decided to make blue on this. So some of it the same as the studio paint scheme, some of it I'm just leaving, especially on that cloth that I really want to leave that white, which I mentioned earlier. So using that Talisar Blue to go all over those areas, trying to be really careful because I want to keep lots of those areas nice and clean and white for the reasons I've already said, and also because I'm going to be using more contrast paints, and that goes much better over a white base or a light base than it does over something dark. And then I've got both of those Fantasy Games range paints on my wet palette, and I'm just starting up with the first layer and giving it a very gentle touch up over all of the edges that are showing up. The Talisar Blue gives such a nice even coat anyway, it looks pretty cool. So you're just tidying it up really and focusing where the contrast paint does its natural job of showing those lighter areas. So I almost use those lines to colour in with. So I'm leaving it in the recesses where it's a bit darker and just basically covering over the lighter parts that are already there, and it just tidies it up, emphasizes it, makes it pop a little bit more. And then I tend to mix that mid-tone and the top highlight together 50-50 to add another little highlight, and then just in a few spots go back with that lightest blue, just to really make it stand out and pop. And how much highlighting you want to do in your own miniatures is up to you. Obviously, the more you add, the more time it takes, but maybe a little bit more striking it looks. A nice little selection now based around contrast Vulpus pink, but then for highlights I have Perisher pink, Hot pink and Neo pink, all from the Tooth & Co's range. I've grabbed them out, I'm going to put them on the wet palette. How far I take those highlights, I'm not sure at the stage, but I'm making sure I'm using the contrast paint just to tint the edge of the feathers on the top. And again, it's looking at that studio artwork and the studio paint job, so the box art and the actual painted miniatures on the box art for inspiration, but not following it exactly. I'm just using it as a bit of a spot colour really against the white and the blue, and as I've already mentioned, I've got more white showing than on that studio paint job by choice, but I still think that this pink is a really nice additional colour. So I'm focusing on the first sort of 3 feathers on that headdress there. The other miniatures in the unit don't have that, they just have a normal plume. Used a little bit of that tie around the back of the horse's tail, feathers on the top of the horse, and then the alternate little sort of rectangular decoration areas on the area on the horse as well. I'm just painting this in with the same contrast colour. After that, it's very much a case of taking each of those 3 colours in that triad and highlighting the individual strands of the feathers and the hairs, building them up one by one, focusing on those raised areas. You could dry brush at this stage. I'm just using the edge of my brush in most cases and just accentuating the work that the contrast paint has already done, but just taking my time, building it up bit by bit, moving to a lighter colour, and then each time just covering a slightly smaller area. Very straightforward, standard layering style paint job. The final stage for those little rectangular areas is just a nice little neat line along the top just to really make them pop and stand out. So this is a skin recipe I've been using a lot recently. We've got a contrast-based flesh for Guilliman flesh, and then Shyish purple and Vulpus pink to tint, and then a highlight of a standard lighter skin tone afterwards. So because we've got the miniature almost white here with this kind of Zenithal layer through the airbrush, and then even that dry brushing as well, it's perfect for contrast paint and a nice even coat, enough to go into those recesses, and you get quite a nice looking skin effect as it is. But to make it look a little less basic, we go back afterwards and change it a little bit, tone it down with a little bit of the purple paint into the recesses around the cuffs, around where the wrist hits the armor, that kind of thing, in the sockets of the eyes, around the edges of the helmet, so you can build up that shadow. And then afterwards I'm also using that Vulpus pink again, thin slightly on my wet palette, and just placing it over the lip area, the bottom half of the mouth, and over the nose, and it just really tints it, changes it, gives it a little bit more depth and variation. You'll notice that I've used the same colour just on the front area of the horse, so that slightly pinker area around the nose and lips of the horse. And then the final elven skin in this case, but any light skin will do, just going back over onto the nose, on the cheekbones, and just making it pop a little bit more after adding those things. I do tend to do my eyes before doing that little final stage. If I do mess it up, I can fix that before I do my final highlight. Now for this army project, this spear shafts and the bows, I'm using skeleton horn, ivory tusk and trooper white. Any white and bone white will do really. The main thing is the skeleton horde here, and nice even coat all over that Zenithor's miniature, but allowing it to fall a little bit thicker around the ends of that spear shaft where the metal parts are going to be. So you don't mind it pulling a little bit there. There'll be some shadow and it looks quite good. You can also focus the pulling a little bit around where it meets other parts of the miniature. So you've got the little strap that's holding the quiver. That can be a little bit darker there as well. But I do try to keep it relatively smooth, blend it out a little bit, and often with a cleaner brush, just take a little bit away in the center as well, and that gives you a highlighted effect as it is. Then after that, on the wet palette, I mix a bit of the skeleton horde with the ivory tusk and just start to lighten it in the center of the spear shaft or on the bow, keeping it away from the direct edges so that you've got that darker shade at each point, lighter in the middle. And then we just slowly then blend up to just ivory tusk on its own, and then adding a little bit of white, and away you go. For the leather areas, I'm going for a tan kind of colour, and the key is the Garagak Sewer contrast paint, but we've also got Gizmo Fur and Manticore Ochre as well, which are perfect highlights for it. Now, you get a nice effect, as with all the contrast colours, as I keep mentioning, over this sort of zenithal effect. So for a nice even coat, you're going to get some shadow in those recesses and highlights built in anyway. So it looks pretty good. And it's just finding colours, from my point of view, to tidy that up afterwards, reinforce it to make it look eventually painted, rather than base coating with a darker shade, which you could do as well. There's not a huge amount of difference, but I quite like base coating in contrast where I can. Find it smoother, you get a better shadow in my opinion, and like I've mentioned before, it tells you where to put those highlights, which is really helpful at times as well. And when you start to highlight, it's very simply a case of whacking those colours on your wet palette and working your way through that mid-tone and then that highlight, just using the edge of my brush here to run along the side of the reins there, picking out the edge and making it pop and stand out a little bit more. You obviously use a little bit of the higher colour as you go through, just slowly build it up so it stands out, pops. You can do little scratches and things on the leather as well, as much as you want to, really. So we have Gryph-hound Orange, Satyr Brown and Manticore Ochre, and I'm playing around with different hair colours in this army, and so far on both miniatures I've done tutorials for, they've been blonde, and this is going to be more of a sort of a reddish colour hair, though we'll probably highlight it slightly towards a yellowish blonde as well. It just looks good with these miniatures, but this Gryph-hound Orange is really, really nice. It runs into the recesses nicely, and you could just leave it like that. It's not a bad effect for hair, and if you've only got a very small amount of hair showing, that might be all you need, but I'm going to tidy it up by highlighting it again, as I have done with all the other processes on this miniature. And just like before, I'm very simply using both of those two colours as a mid-tone and a highlight, focusing on the tops of those individual strands of hair, which are quite thick, using the edge of my brush where I can to make it easier, painting them in and making them pop, and then moving on to that top highlight, slightly smaller lines so that you can still see the previous layers, and it just starts to sort of stand out a little bit more and looks pretty good. Now this is a very subtle triad. You could easily leave out the middle one, but we've got Sokote Silver, Plate Armour and Mithril Blade. I want to make a nice clean looking armour, so I'm building up with these, layering the same way as I have with all of the triads. Trying to be really neat here. Metallic paints can be a little bit problematic when you get them somewhere you don't want them, because you can wash them away, but it tends to leave that metallic sheen. And because we've got that lovely white we've prepared quite nicely, we've got all that blue trim we've done, I'm taking my time and making sure I don't get it anywhere I don't want it. So I'm just building up with all three layers of those paints. So we get to the second layer, focusing on where the light would hit, but making sure I'm leaving some of that original layer showing each time. And then as we get up to that very top layer, the brighter silver, I'm making sure I'm just picking out those individual scales of armour towards the top of the helmet where the light would hit more, but also sometimes just around the brow as well, just to make it pop and stand out a little bit. For the golds, I'm using Metal and Alchemy range from Scale 75, Necro Gold and Elven Gold. Very simple two colour system. Necro Gold first, and then highlight with the Elven Gold, which really kind of gives it some warmth and gives it some extra shine, which is just what you're after. There's significantly less gold on the miniature than there is the steel colour, but I still want to pick it out, and it really changes it up and breaks it up a little bit. You got a little area over the stomach, you got parts on the shoulder pads, you've got designs on the helmet, and then the hilt and the pommel on the sword, and even some of the little jewels that are hanging around over the chainmail as well. It really breaks up that silver and sort of adds an extra depth and a little bit of warmth to what would be a very cold miniature on its own afterwards. It's still pretty cool, there's lots of blues and a very bluish white, but it just adds a little bit of balance back to it, which I think works really well. And once that kind of final highlight, that Elven Gold, goes on, it really just starts to pop and stand out, and I think it's starting to come together. I'm using the Spirit Stone technical paint on all of the Spirit Stones on this army just to speed things up, and there are a lot of them. They just look lovely when you paint them in with different layers and shade them and add a little highlight to the top. But this is an army piece. I'm trying to build an army that looks pretty striking, but the strikingness comes from the overall look and the power of the white looking so smooth rather than the little details like this. So these are a really cool way of doing it. Just directly over metallic paints, it works really, really well. I want to be careful with the washes. I'm using an oil wash, a ready mix one from scale 75. This is quite a sepia tone. I'm using an old brush and I'm almost pin washing in as much as I can. So I want to keep it as clean as possible, but because it's an oil wash, I can clean it up afterwards, which is the slight difference if you're using a digital wash, which is fine as well. But if you do, I would be very, very careful. Otherwise, you're going to be going back in with your metallics and tidying them up, which is fine as well. But you're repeating a lot of work doing that. And these are definitely a way of speeding up the process, but also adding a pretty cool effect as well. But oils do run into the recesses a little bit easier than standard washes anyway. And they give a really, really nice effect when they dry. When it comes to the male areas, I'm trying to focus on the recess. It does run over the top of them a little bit. Like I said, though, I can tidy it up quite well, which I'll show you in a few moments. To tidy it up, I'm using this AK thinner, so it's an artist-based thinner. Still smells a little bit, but nowhere near as strong as something you might get from your DIY. And I'm using the same old brush, which I've cleaned off, dipping it in, drying it off on a paper towel. You can just go back anywhere you've got your oils once they're dry, and just wipe it away again. So you're just removing any tide marks, anything you don't want that's looking a little bit too dull, and wipe it away. There's other ways of removing it as well. You can buff it off with sponges and things, but because this miniature I want to look quite clean and tidy, and I've been quite deliberate where I place the oils in the first place anyway, I'm just using the brush to clean them up, tidy them up, return it back to that almost that pure paint, so it's nice and shiny. It just leaves it on those recesses. And it's super simple, really nice to do, and dries again in no time whatsoever. This is Carcharodon Grey and White Star. Now, I think this is very much an optional stage. There's loads of stages in this painting video that are optional, but because we did quite a good job on the white earlier on, you can leave a lot of it with the airbrush stages. I think the grey here on the mane and the tail is probably more important, and it's just a nice way of going back and tidying up what you've done over the top of that apothecary white even sort of glaze that we put over afterwards. So the grey first on its own, using the edge of my brush as much as I can just to highlight some of those strands of the hair, tidy them up a little bit, make them pop. And then what I slowly do is mix a little bit of white in with that as well, just to lighten it. And again, use that a little bit less, just where the light is focused towards the tops or those strands that stick out the most. By the time we get to the hair strands on the horse's feet, it's just pure white here, and I've got the white on my wet palette. I'm trying to do really smooth strokes, focusing towards the bottom, so we don't have these really visible strokes. They should just visibly look a little bit bolder and brighter. And if you get the right thickness of your paint and you're neat enough with it, that's the kind of effect you'll get. And it's amazing what a difference and how much tidier that makes it look. But we are moving into that kind of very much optional stage now, because we put so much work into getting that white right through the airbrush and then by recess shading that you don't have to do this. But the difference that adding some subtle highlights like I'm doing now onto the cloth really makes it look super special and really pop. And I'm using the side of my brush here just to pick out that most prominent edge. It's amazing what a difference it makes. But like I said, this is optional. This is edge highlighting now, which we've avoided for most of the miniature, but it does make a difference if you're willing to kind of spend that little bit of extra time to do it. And that was it. Time to edge that base and tidy it all up. And we have a finished miniature, but let's go and have a look at some proper pictures. I think it's a really stunning sculpt. It wasn't the easiest miniature I've ever painted. It's quite hard to do sub-assemblies on these. You could do if you wanted to. You could definitely leave off the quiver and the spear. It would definitely help. It was hard to get into certain areas, but when I'm army painting, I like to try and avoid that as much as possible, especially when I'm using the airbrush to start with zenithal, because that helps you with all your light, and it's harder to do that and put that back on afterwards. Obviously, if you're painting this for a competition level or something like that, it's absolutely what you would do. But this is just a champion in a unit that will be used on the tabletop for something planned in the future. But I still had loads of fun doing it, but it did take me a little bit longer than I would normally like for a normal trooper like this. But it's a modern miniature and it's got loads of detail and it looks fantastic. So it's worth it in the end. I'm glad they're only in small units of 5 and I'm not painting a big brick of 15 or something of these, but they are stunning and you could spend less time on them if you wanted to. And hopefully you've enjoyed it, and there may be some techniques that you steal, maybe some things you think, well, why would you do that? But that's the fun of making these videos and sharing them with you. Thank you very much, Games Workshop, for sending me the miniatures ahead of time so I could work on them. I really appreciate that. I know I'm privileged to do that, and hopefully you seeing these videos will help you make your mind up whether you want to purchase them for yourself or give you some ideas of how you may paint your own high elf projects in the future. And do let me know in the comments below what you've got planned for your own high elf armies or other races in the old world. This isn't the only miniature I've been sent as well, so do look out for more tutorials. I've been beavering away in the background, so look out for the new Lord of Thrace. That will be coming up very soon. There might even be a little picture of the thumbnail in the corner there, so check that out when it's out.
Thank you again to Games Workshop for sending me those early. It was really fun to get to grips with the new miniatures, and I hope you've enjoyed the video, seeing how they went together and how I painted them, whether you choose to follow that or not in your own armies. Let me know in the comments below what you think of the paint scheme, whether you're going to be collecting these yourself. I'd really love to know what people's plans are for high elves in the armies of the old world. If you've enjoyed the video, please do comment below, give us a like, subscribe to the channel. Those things really genuinely help. And if you'd like to support me further, please do check out the channel sponsor and all the other links in the video description, including my affiliate links. If you really want to support me, please check out my Patreon, because it is the best way to help me afford to keep making videos like this. But thank you very much for watching. Take care, and I'll catch you soon.